All right. So welcome everybody to the ESWB All Participants Meeting, July 2021 seminar. Just to give you a little bit of forewarning, this meeting is being recorded, but it's also being streamed live on Facebook. So if you don't want to have your image online, you're welcome to turn off your cameras. I believe most people have their cameras off at this moment in time. My name is Greg Jesmok. I'm a graduate student ambassador from CSU-Northridge in California. And I'm joined by my co-moderators as well, Deepshikha Upadhyay, who's a graduate student ambassador from UCLA. She will be the point person for any communication or technical difficulties. So if anything is occurring on your end regarding Zoom, let her know. You can do it either through chat. I'm not sure if Deep would like to be contacted in any other way at this moment in time. She'll put that into the chat for you though. Thank you for doing that. Now it's being recorded for sure. There's also another co-moderator, Sameera Musa, graduate student ambassador from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. She'll be moderating the question submissions via Slido. And so I believe Deep's going to be sharing that into the chat as well. This is just an app that will enable us to kind of gather all of the questions that arise during the meeting and put them into one database where we can see them moving forward. So if you wanted to see what questions arose during the meeting, we'll just have that as a log, as opposed to having to go back to this particular video in time to come. Also, Marie Makuate is coming as a graduate student ambassador from Bamela University of Science and Technology in Cameroon. And we were going to ask her to translate questions into French, but Dr. Pincetl has actually stated that she will be able to likely answer any questions in French. We still may have Marie translate, or I don't know if Dr. Pincetl may be able to translate any questions that come in through English into French for those of us joining from Cameroon. So Environmental Science Without Borders, for those of you that are joining us for the first time, is a multinational peer mentorship program developed by students for students and scientists around the globe to come together, learn from one another, and develop together in the field of environmental science. As a community, we offer peer mentoring, networking opportunities, and general advice relevant to those intent on advancing their education and or career within the earth and environmental science. At UCLA, we operate as a subsidiary of the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science, or CDLS. And this operates as the first university center to focus on diversity in environmental science through investments in student scientific retention, belonging through mentorship, outreach, and active learning through collaborative research and teaching environments. And today we are fortunate to have a faculty fellow of CDLS join us as our speaker, Dr. Stephanie Pincetl. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Pincetl.
Thank you very much, Greg. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today, this morning in LA, this afternoon in Cameroon and other places. I am a professor at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. I direct a center on sustainable cities at UCLA. And in that center, we look at the requirements of large-scale cities for energy, water, and other kinds of materials with a focus on justice. So how are these kinds of resources distributed, who benefits and who doesn't, and what are the institutional structures that kind of shape that inequality, if you will. We are also very interested in looking at the question of what is sufficient and what the Earth planet can really support in terms of going forward in the modernization paradigm. And of course, the situation in the developed West is quite different than in places like Cameroon and others, which have not had the benefit of this kind of modernization paradigm to the same extent. In fact, have suffered from devolution due to colonialism and imperialism. So keeping that in mind, my remarks are really oriented towards the kinds of cities that exist in the West, although some of it really applies to developing nations and to cities in other places, because we really have to think about how we want to develop, what we want these cities to do for us, the quality of life in the cities, and well-being. And I think there are lots of questions to be raised about whether consumption and modernization is the end-all and be-all of well-being, particularly since that relies on wage labor. That is, I would contend, another kind of, slavery might be a very strong term to use, but it is not something that really necessarily provides people fulfillment. You work for money. You don't necessarily work for other reasons because the structure of the system isn't organized that way. So in light of those remarks, I'm going to run through this slideshow and hopefully leave some time for discussion. So thank you for inviting me, and I am going to go to my slides. Let's see, share. Can you see that, everybody? Is that good? All right. So what I want to talk about today really is getting beyond the tropes around the cities for the 21st century. We've heard a lot about cities, and oops, I've lost my cursor all of a sudden. Hold on just a second. There it is. All right. So the common tropes that we hear, at least in the literature, we see in the literature, there's a lot of discussion on sustainable city plans and so on, that cities can be sustainable, that they can achieve carbon neutrality, and the mechanisms are through green infrastructure, right? Cities can become sponges, for example, is a common idea now. They can plant trees to sequester carbon and so forth. And that through the energy transition and renewable energy, they will be net zero carbon. It'll generate lots of green jobs. And these are really ideas that come from a way of thinking that is known as eco-modernization. And it's really centered on this concept of energy efficiency. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So what do we know? Well, we know that more people are urban than ever in history. It's a kind of, humans have finally evolved to be urban species. That is kind of the pinnacle of development of human beings, which is a kind of bizarre idea. So if you live in the countryside and you're a farmer, you're not really developed or evolved. So we also know that cities continue to grow extensively and intensively, that greenhouse gas emissions are rising despite all our best efforts, or not very best efforts, that material flows per capita are rising. And that's a very significant issue, because that means that the Earth resources continue to be mined at a very extreme rate, which implies lots of environmental transformation that we forget when we live in cities because we're in this kind of bubble. So that cities require greater and greater hinterlands to function. You get a kind of rationalization of the countryside in order to extract resources for the city, industrial agriculture and so forth. We also know that we're in an era of great extinctions. And we have to remember, and we don't actually understand that quite sufficiently, that modernity has risen on a sea of oil. We would not have the kind of modernity we have today had we not had the hydrocarbon energy resource, period. So what does this mean? It means that contemporary cities and the global economy are inextricably interwoven with humans' ability to harness fossil energy. While there's a lot of discussion about vehicles that will use batteries or hydrogen or anything like that, we still are not in a place where those gigantic bulldozers and mining machines can run on batteries, right? Or hydrogen. We don't produce hydrogen yet to do that. So you have to remember that the ability to extract resources is really based in this incredible source of energy, which is fossil energy. And so none of what we experience today would be possible without the use of oil. Jet planes, cargo ships, you name it. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that no cities on the planet have ever been sustainable. All cities have been net importers of materials and exporters of waste. I mean, it's just logical, right? Most cities don't grow all their food. Most cities don't recycle all their trash inside the city, and so forth. So this whole idea of sustainable cities is a kind of misleading concept in my estimation, even though I've done a lot of work on it. So that being said, in fact, it's a kind of misleading idea. So what about carbon neutrality? Everybody, you know, Europe is going to be carbon neutral in whatever it is, the newest version of that came out this week. But what does carbon neutrality really mean? It means relying on somewhere else to accept the carbon produced by that entity, whether it's preserving forests in places that have forests so that we can continue to produce as much CO2. Right? That's what carbon neutrality means. And there are no sufficient, stable, and reliable sinks to do so. They're simply not. There are not enough forests. The oceans are saturated. The carbon sequestration and storage areas are unproven. Truly, there are some for sure, but how much, right? How much? And how do you get that carbon into those storage areas is still very energy intensive, if it's possible at all. So it's a kind of, you have to think about the life cycle analysis and a kind of thermodynamic equation to really understand whether or not this is feasible into the future. And then certainly not cook stoves. Cook stoves are not going to be the solution to CO2 emissions. So the only real path is not to burn fossil fuels. I mean, let's be simple and clear. So I'm going to go through a whole set of these concepts and debunk them. And I don't mean to be pessimistic here. I just mean to be really realistic so that we can reset our framing to what we actually need to do in a serious-minded way. So green infrastructure. I think today's approach is a feel-good, really thin layer of icing on urban infrastructures that were built in a manner generally incompatible with the goals of green infrastructure. Cities have not been designed with GI or nature services in mind. They haven't. The topography has been modified. The hydrology has been modified. The soils have been modified. We have paid no attention, at least in the more modern cities, to climate and weather. Oh, I meant to say wind patterns. Sorry, that's an error. Wind patterns, sun, rain, and the rest, right? Are the streets oriented to capture the prevailing breezes? No. Are the windows of buildings oriented to ensure that there's good ventilation? No. Do we design the cities as sponges to begin with? No. And you could go on down the list. And so what we're doing is thinking that, oh, we'll just slap on these green infrastructures and remedy all of those historical issues about this hard infrastructure that has been in place. And in fact, if you look around, at least in the West, a lot of the green infrastructure requires a great deal more infrastructure for that infrastructure. So you pour concrete for the bioswales. It's like, well, wait a minute, what is the embedded carbon in that concrete that you've just poured for the bioswale or the curb cuts and so on? So we're not really systematically thinking about this. It's a kind of, like I said, feel-good approach that is not deeply systematic. So the other thing is, we have to remember that so much CO2 is emitted in cities that, for example, tree sequestration is minuscule. I mean, it's ridiculous. Yes, they do sequester carbon, but maybe we should have less cars and they could then do their job better. Plus, trees have to be robust, they have to be large, and they have to be healthy. And we don't build cities for large, robust and healthy trees. We build cities for cars. You know, the planting strips, at least in the cities that I know of, are really skinny. Those poor trees really struggle to survive. They're not well maintained. They're hit by trees. They're hit by trucks. People hate them because they raise the roots, raise the sidewalks, you name it. And we're not really serious about a true infrastructure of nature in the city. So how do you reduce CO2 emissions? Well, you eliminate cars and the use of hydrocarbons, because you have to think about all of the heat that's generated by these motors in the city, including heat pumps, right? Even if they were solar, you had solar generation, that heat is generated by all of the activities in the city. So green walls, green roofs, and so on are unlikely to make much impact. They are, however, very aesthetically pleasing, and we cannot downplay the importance of beauty in the city for feeling like you have a welcoming city, a dignified city, a beautiful city. It's much nicer to live in a beautiful city than an ugly city. So those kinds of attributes are significant, but we have to really understand that they're not free. Flood control and green infrastructure, similar kinds of sets of problems. You need a vast re-engineering of stormwater systems, the introduction of permeable surfaces. We need areas for water reinfiltration, and so forth. So I want to turn very quickly to the question of renewables. Named Vaclav Smil. He's a very crazy guy, and he's written more books than you can possibly imagine. But he's a very serious scholar, and he points out that if we want to use biofuels, for example, to create hydrogen or energy at all, he estimates that for the energy demand forecast for 2050, we would have to devote an area 10 times larger than the total area of arable land today, and 30% of all forests. So it's important to do these kinds of empirical analyses of the implications of all of these different alternatives, these kind of eco-modernized ideas that get thrown out very easily. Wind projects run into a fundamental power density imperative because wind turbine drag on local winds of large wind farms limit electrical generation. So we have to be very serious about this. For PV-based U.S. electricity generation to satisfy the U.S., it would require an area of about 52,000 kilometers square. What are the trade-offs, right? If you're putting in solar, what are you not having in that land? Agriculture, forests, ecosystem services, and so on, right? It's not a win-win situation, sadly enough. So he, I can give you the reference later. I'm sorry I didn't cite it, but you can see the kinds of calculations that Dr. Smil makes, and I think that we have to really, really be serious about such analysis. Whoops, sorry. Oops. Okay, so the upshot, what's the upshot? Well, it's kind of obvious. An entirely renewable energy system to satisfy current energy use would occupy 20 to 50% of US territory. And the sad thing is that fossil hydro and nuclear uses a lot less land. I'm not advocating for fossil or nuclear, believe me. But when we talk about the need to get off of fossil fuels, and we are averse to nuclear, which I am, what does that imply actually for energy supply? And once we understand that, we begin to have a different view of how you develop into the future in order to live in a way that reflects the resource limitations of those energy sources. So hydro fossil energy is an incredible energy source. I mean, it is a fantastic energy source. The UK would need nearly its entire territory to produce the amount of energy by renewables it uses today. And any of these alternative energy systems take a really long time to put in place. Dr. Smil talks about, the 50, 100, 150 year time period it took to put the fossil energy system into place. And while we're trying to accelerate the renewable energy resources, it doesn't happen overnight unless there's an enormous will and dedication to do so, which is not so evident today. So all of these grids have to be installed, and we have to remember that they too are very energy and materials intensive to produce and install. If you look at those big wind towers, wind machines, the amount of materials in those big wind machines is huge, right? And all of the electronic machine switches and all of that part of it is not materials inexpensive, rare earth minerals and so on. Copper is a really big one. Copper resources are becoming less of less good quality, which means you have to expend more energy to mine the copper. There's an issue of the second law of thermodynamics here. So what about the promise of greater efficiency? Well, John Jeavons, an early British economist, noted that more efficiency, economical use of a resource will not lead to a diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth. If you have we've seen rebound effects, right? It is a ubiquitous problem. You have a more fuel efficient car, you drive more. You have a more efficient air conditioning system, you tend to use it more, and so on. It's an actually well-documented phenomenon. And so this question of technological progress through efficiency, and that the idea of efficiency is going to reduce energy use or materials use is a nice idea, but unless you cap the energy use, you're really not going to be able to achieve the kinds of results that you want. So there's a very, very good report, if you're interested, by the European Environmental Bureau 2019. And this report, at least for the European context, claims that there are 7 reasons to be skeptical of energy efficiency and decoupling. We have rising energy expenditures now. And as I mentioned about copper, the best resource stocks have been extracted. So it's now more resource and energy intensive per unit extracted for getting more minerals and materials out. So that's just true, right? We have really used a lot of stuff. We have the rebound effect. We have a problem shifting, right? So from one set of resources to another set of resources. So now we're mining lithium, we're doing cobalt, and so on, which is a different set of inputs to the energy system than we had before. We underestimate the impact of services. These too have high energy costs. We know that transportation, say you get your food delivered and things like that, have very, very high energy costs in the end. Sadly, we have a limited potential of recycling. We have very slow rates. It needs a lot of energy to recycle, right? You have to expend energy to get the resources out, and they are degraded, right? So you have to process them a second time. Plastics, single-use plastics, they're done. You can't reuse those because the quality of that plastic is really not good enough to do much with it. We have insufficient and inappropriate technical change. We are not thinking of appropriate technologies, right? We aren't really thinking, we're under this paradigm that we can invent our way out of this dilemma with fancy things. We don't think about the practical things like openable windows oriented towards where the wind blows. And then we have cost shifting like cap and trade, which I'm happy to talk about if you are unfamiliar with. So here are the facts, right? Global material extraction has increased by a factor of 12 between 1900 and 2015. And every 10% rise in GDP is accompanied by a 6% rise in material footprint. And so now we have between 8.2 and 8 tons per capita. Sorry, I think that was 18.2 and 8.2 tons per capita. And there seems to be, in fact, a rematerialization change in material intensity, according to this study. Energy intensity seems to be consistent with growth. And in most developed countries, emissions are rising or stabilizing at a high rate. There has been really no decoupling of economic activity and land use. On the contrary, high-income countries are displacing land use impacts outside their own footprints, like food, growing green beans in Senegal for the consumers in Paris, for example. No decoupling of economic, and biodiversity loss, again, the typo, is accelerating, and there's a constant relationship between economic growth and biodiversity loss. So not a very optimistic analysis here. So the current prevailing ideas about cities reducing their impacts through sustainability are clearly inadequate and are not working. So what are the alternatives? We need to really rethink the economic paradigm that has been guiding the planet, particularly since the fall of the wall of Berlin. And because we must no longer predicate well-being on growth. Redistribution is certainly something that can be done, needs to be done, and hasn't happened. So for humans to, I think, for humans to reduce their impact, cities must radically change. We can't look to economic growth as a way to improve well-being. We need to reduce energy and material flows and to degrow in the West. And what does that mean is a very delicate problem or very delicate question. But I think we have a lot of work to be done to figure out what that means. And it's a kind of exciting idea, actually. And finally, I think we do need to rethink cities. Renewables will not be able to substitute for fossil energy, period. And that means that the cities as they are today can't function. They just simply can't function the way they are today. So let's roll this back just a second. Why do people move to cities? They move to cities because of economic opportunity. They move to cities for education, to escape from provincialism, tradition, and oppression, and because people can no longer maintain a livelihood in rural areas. I claim that there's been a kind of new enclosure movement that's taken place globally that continues to force people off the land through free trade agreements around food. Like in Mexico, once a free trade agreement got implemented around corn and importing corn into Mexico, it meant that the small farmers who had these very traditional forms of agriculture and also enormous wealth in seed diversity could no longer survive. And what do you do? Well, you move to a city, right? And then you live in very poor circumstances and scramble to get a job. So I think that this idea that everybody absolutely wants to move into a city is a little bit misleading, because in a lot of ways people have to move into cities, and the rural infrastructure of education, health, and opportunity has been neglected, severely neglected around the world. In contrast to the first part of the 20th century, where there was a lot of investment in capacity in different regions and in the countryside. So I think it's important to keep that in mind and to think about, well, if we want to address this conundrum that we have around carbon, what are the opportunities to revitalize other kinds of livelihoods? So economic opportunity is the flip side of no longer being able to have a decent livelihood in the countryside. And universal education policies have failed in many places due to a lack of funding. And that's the flip side of the escape from provincialism and oppression, especially for women. So if you're not investing in educational opportunities in the countryside, well, sure, if you want your daughter to have any kind of opportunity, you move to the city. So it's a really forced urbanization in addition to urban areas having all these other kinds of attributes. But there's also the forced part of it. So recasting the future, I think we need to move from the development paradigm into rediscovering place, skill, and local knowledge. We have devalued local knowledge. I have recently written an essay about reviving California agriculture post-carbon, and I described the future as the creation of a California peasantry. And I've had people read this essay and they say, peasantry, right? And you look at the dictionary definition of peasantry, and it's this kind of completely ignorant view of what peasantries are. Peasantries are extremely skilled, knowledgeable people who know how to work the land in a specific place. But that kind of local knowledge is being eradicated through industrial agriculture. And that's a very, 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 very concerning development. We also need to establish, particularly in the West, the concept of sufficiency in the place of efficiency. As I've explained, we need to reinvest in rural places. We need to reduce the size of megacities and rethink how much energy is needed. High-rise buildings, you see these glossy high-rise buildings in most capitals today. Well, they are enormously energy consuming per square foot. All that glass, those elevators and everything else. Can we really do that anymore? You know how much energy is needed to produce steel and glass? An enormous amount. Can we afford to do that? Can we produce those resources with renewables? Unlikely at the scale that we're doing it today. So I am positing that we need smaller, lower energy cities in the future. And we need to design and redesign with nature to incorporate those assets into the built environment for water supply, heating, and cooling. We have to think about the attributes of the place to design with the place. I know where the prevailing breezes come from, where I live. I know the situation of groundwater. I know the difference in soils across the city and so on. And we just need to decouple from the modernist paradigm that has run its course. So what can cities be for the 21st century? They can be places of learning. You can come to the city, take advantage of the concentration of knowledge there, learn all kinds of different things, from music to literature to science to art to philosophy to ethics training, which is something that we don't have and really need, particularly in the West, I think. It can be a place of mercantile commerce. You can bring your goods and to trade and exchange. They can be places of training and hybrid thinking and approaches that couple scientific knowledge with local practices and indigenous knowledge and practices. So what does it look like to think about agriculture in the future using traditional and historic understanding and the seed stock, but in a more determined way to foster soil fertility through ecological science, right? Hybrid thinking here. They can be places of training in the virtues of patience, empathy, courage, and ethical conduct. We don't have any place where that kind of thinking is nurtured. And to live well together and with the planet going forward, we have to rethink, we have to retrain our brain to be more understanding of the other and of where we live. And only through those kinds of virtues will we be able to emerge with less conflict. And it's an extraordinarily important problem that we have today of resorting to conflict to resolve problems that really can be resolved in other ways that are less taxing on humans and on nature. I mean, wars are really bad for nature. So cities can be places of innovation and craft, reuse, reinvention, and the recentering of humans into being in place. Of course, it raises a lot of other questions like provincialism, like small thinking, right? But I think that if we have the training in virtues, that it actually compensates for the trend, the tendency towards provincialism. Humans, as we know, are extremely plastic, right? We can be trained to do all kinds of things, right? If you're in the army or in the armed forces, you're trained to think in a certain way, right? There's billions of dollars, trillions of dollars spent to train warriors, right? Well, trillions of dollars to train people in the virtues of patience, empathy, courage, and ethical conduct would go pretty far too, right? So we have both, right? We have the tendency towards generosity and empathy. We have the tendency towards violence and hate. Which do we want to nurture? And what resources do we apply in order to encourage that and inculcate that? I think that's a huge question going forward. So that's it. I am done. And I thank you for your patience and generosity in listening to my talk, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, so we're going to turn it over to questions now. I'm going to repaste what Deep previously put in the chat. If you'd like to ask a question, if you'd please submit it through Slido down here. And I believe we have a few questions. I'm going to allow for Sameera to take over at this point and read out those questions.
I think I'm actually in charge of that aspect of this.
My apologies.
Okay, so Dr. Pincetl, I don't know if you could also access the Slido link just to see what I read out in case something I say doesn't come across clearly, but our first question here from an anonymous contributor was, if the West needs to degrow, would you recommend the same idea for growing cities in places like Africa where people are struggling with basic needs?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question, actually. And I think that what is meant by degrowth in the West is certainly very different than what might be possible in places in developing countries. And I think it's the question of the direction of growth and the quality of growth. And the countries that are not entirely trapped by the modernist paradigm, which has been an extremely powerful paradigm, will have the opportunity to avail themselves of local knowledge and understanding of place that the modernist paradigm overpowers through the use of fossil energy. So I'll give you an example. In Los Angeles, we have huge resources of groundwater. Do we manage that groundwater resource as a common property resource and really nurture it for its long-term sustainable yield? No, because what we have is we have these enormous water conveyance systems that come from the mountains and brings water down to Southern California. So we have had no investment really in understanding how to manage place. So what the modernist paradigm tends to do is jump over the kinds of resources and ability to satisfy needs in a more modest but equitable way through infrastructure, large scale, very expensive infrastructure. So what I would say is, rather than degrowth, I would say that what is important is to think about appropriate technologies that answer the problem of the place rather than aspire to become like every place else. So that would be how I would answer the question. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Our next question was submitted by Dr. Olani, who, hello. He said GI, which I assume stands for green infrastructure, as you've said before, is capital intensive. How realistic is adopting the GI concept in growing sustainable cities by low-income/developing communities?
Another excellent question. I would say that depending on the urban form that exists, that will tell you how much GI is possible. That is to say, if you have to depave, that's extremely expensive. If, for example, you have a situation of a lot of development without very robust infrastructure, then it may be possible to do things like bioswales and stormwater infiltration, because you don't have to undo a lot. But I think, again, it's very, very site-specific and place-specific. It's hard to say in general terms. If you have a city that doesn't have very well-defined and paved streets, you might be more able to plant, and a rainy climate, you might be able to plant trees because they are not fighting against the car. So, it really, there's not a general answer for that. It really depends on the specifics of the topography and land use of the place. It's not a very satisfying answer, I understand, but I do agree with Dr. Olani that GI is very capital intensive and infrastructure intensive. So I think it depends on the level of embedded infrastructure and the flexibility that's possible within that.
Great, thank you again. Our next question here, are there conceptual designs of these green cities that we can virtually explore?
I don't know. I wish I did. I really just can't answer that question. I'd have to do some homework.
Alrighty, no worries there. This is another one I'm liking. How does the cityscape change with expansion into space? Is this a prospective solution to our energy use within cities?
Oh, that's a very good question, in the sense that obviously a lower scale city has more potential for distributed generation, right? Solar panels supplemented with some kind of storage. But at the same time, and let's say the possibility for urban agriculture, far more infiltration of water. But what are the trade-offs, I think, is the question. So if you're having this kind of low scale, low intensity urbanization that sprawls out, of specificity. You really have to look at the place and think about what the intent is of that different urban form. Might it not be better to contain the city, let's say, just as a trade-off, and then have intensive peri-urban agriculture, and have people who live in the city go out to the rural area, farm, and then bring the produce back, right? More like a medieval city in your conceptual imagination, right? So I think that's a very good question, and should be explored, right? We really need to look at those kinds of opportunities and trade-offs.
All right. There's a couple more here. How do we shift to a city focused on accentuating place, skill, and local knowledge in the face of a capitalist me first society?
Yes, that is the question, isn't it? I don't have a ready solution to that. I think that maybe I'm a product of my generation. I was involved, I'm a kind of 1968 person who went out on the streets to protest, and the 1970s involved in lots of protest movements. And I think that we need to concentrate once again on political movements. And I know that in some parts of the world, that is extremely dangerous. And even in the United States now, in the face of the rise of the Trump phenomena, it's very dangerous. But I don't see any other way to effectuate change. If you look at human history, how has change occurred? It's occurred through struggle. And I'm perfectly cognizant of the, I don't mean to sound flip or arrogant. I am really aware that people die in so doing. But I don't know any other way to go about getting change to happen. I really just don't. Yeah, we don't do it through the internet. We don't do it through Twitter. We don't do it through consumption choices. Oh, I don't buy through Amazon. Who cares, right? I don't, but it's like, it's such a trivial, I mean, for Amazon, it has no meaning at all, right? So I'm aware that of the difficulty, and I don't think that these modern ideas of choice really, I think that they are a distraction that has been very well developed by the forces that are in control.
Got it. Okay. There's two more that I'm seeing. Do you agree with the idea of the environmental Kuznets curve, especially for cities in developing countries?
I think it's ridiculous. I think it's just some kind of imaginary idea that Kuznets had that became popular. I think it's one of the most perplexing approaches to things that I've seen. It makes no sense to me at all. Might make sense to other people, makes no sense to me. So I can't, it's like, what? I don't even understand what the premise is here. So not to be insulting to anybody, but I just don't get it. I just think it's kind of weird. But so that's my opinion about the environmental Kuznets curve. Pardon my bluntness here, but I just find it. Please explain this to me. How does this work? Okay, sorry.
No worries at all. And our last one, this might be covering stuff which has been mentioned already, but what is the path of low-income countries to economic security while trying to keep everything Dr. Pincetl has said in mind?
Well, look, I mean, honestly, I am not an expert on either developing countries or developing countries in Africa. So with that said, I would say that the dependency on the West is extraordinarily undermining of the capacity, the imagination, the knowledge, the innovation, potential, and existing situation in developing countries. And that they have sadly really been through the process of colonialism and imperialism brought into the Western paradigm and have been deeply undermined. So my gut feeling is that we're African countries to say, thank you, no more. We are taking charge of our own destiny. We do not care to have your military here. We do not care to have your arms here. We do not care to have your aid here. You're telling us how to develop our resources and your trade agreements. We're done. It's time for us to assert our own vision. Frankly, I think that is obviously pretty difficult. It's easy, like I said, you know, I'm not an expert, and so it may sound completely stupid, unrealistic, and arrogant. I'm completely, please let me know. But it just seems to me that it's time for the West to get its act together and take care of its own business. And countries that have been oppressed through imperialism for 500 years now need to say, we've had enough. So that would be my, and it's easier, obviously easier said than done, that's for sure. I mean, look, even the national boundaries that were established by mostly the British, right? The British and the French. What are those? They're like this idea of nation state that get imported to places that never had those concepts before. And it has screwed things up royally, right? I mean, everything I read is like, oh my God, this is insane, right? So ethnic rivalries, the lack of remembering all kinds of ways of agreements and negotiation and trust building and methods and stuff, all that's been evacuated through these kinds of ideas of nation state. I think the nation state is a really flawed concept in many, many parts of the world. So anyway, I'm digressing here, but the question opened up a Pandora's box for sure.
All right, thank you very much. That is every question that has been messaged. I'll open it up to the general room in case anybody would like to just unmute themselves and ask Dr. Pincetl anything. Otherwise, I'll hand it back over to Greg.
I also want to be cognizant of everybody's time. I know that it's just crested the hour. Here it's 9 a.m. So I guess if there aren't any questions, I'd like to say thank you very much, Dr. Pincetl. It's been fairly eye-opening. I appreciate it. One last thing that I also want to say is I plugged this a little bit earlier, but for those of you that are just joining, again, I just put a link into the chat for ESWB, which is the organization that is hosting this event. If you would please check that out in your time, if you haven't before, you can go to the Get Involved. I'm actually going to try to share this here. Get Involved section, and you can sign up with us to receive future notifications of these seminars, or if you want to join us in meetings to plan future events or different material that we can do. We've talked about doing outreach to communities nearby at various chapters as well. Yeah, please join us. Please sign up to receive some information from us. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate having that communication. And let's see, finally, we are also going to be sending out in the next week or two some follow-up survey asking about the seminar, how if it hit those points that you'd like to see in an ESWB seminar as well, and if you can give us kind of feedback on what worked, what didn't work, including just logistical stuff for us. You know, if Slido didn't work well for you, if you wouldn't like to see my face, you'd like to see somebody else's face. You know, those sorts of things. You know, so we'll send out a survey on that, and we'll ask you about the next seminar date, which the next seminar should be hosted by the South African chapter. This is in September. And so we'll ask you about a potential seminar date, and also speakers and topics, and any other concerns you may have. I want to just make sure that I'm not missing anything in chat here. Cool. Yeah, and thank you so much again for joining us. I don't have anything else to say. It's really great to see faces that we haven't seen before, and also some people that we have seen. It's great to see you guys back online. So I know it's been a long time waiting to have these all participants meetings again. So thank you again, Dr. Pincetl. Thank you again for everybody joining us. And hopefully you see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your attention and your forbearance for this talk that may have been slightly unexpected. All right, bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.